as well. I'm going to give about a 20-minute or so talk because I'm an English person. I have it written out for me so that I don't, kind of wander off into other topics. And did I just hit that? And I'm going to, I have slides, so I'm going to share my screen so that you can also look at some of these places that I'm talking about. And, oh, it's giving me two choices. I'm going to go with that one. Let's see if that's right. That looks right. We'll believe it is. Okay, so as you notice, I changed my title a little tiny bit. I thought writing this over the past week and just thinking about the divisions that we face, I thought that they really tied into something that's more like lessons from. So lessons from Heritage Museum, Truth and Reconciliation lessons from Heritage Museums. So I want to start by saying that I'm a professor of rhetoric. And when I say rhetoric, a lot of times people either have no idea what that is, or they think I study either political speeches or advertising. And while that is not what I do, those are both definitely rhetoric. In the classical sense, rhetoric is the art of persuasion, convincing others to see things from, one way of thinking of it is convincing others to see things from your point of view, helping fellow citizens make the choices that you think are best. This gets a bad rap. They're trying to trick me. And it got a bad rap in Aristotle's time as well. But like the Greeks, if you think about it, if you sincerely believe an action is right, shouldn't you want to know how to convince others to consider it as well? The modern sense of rhetoric is a bit less focused on pure persuasion and more ready to see that everything that we communicate is potentially loaded with rhetoric because that is the way that humans work. I generally tell people that I study the way we use language and language uses us. So my specialty is a branch of modern rhetoric that focuses on two key theories of Kenneth Burke, a mid-20th century scholar who jump-started what we now call modern rhetorical studies. One of his concepts is that persuading others is based not on our clever use of facts or even our ability to induce strong emotions. It is based on our ability to identify with our audience and to get the audience to identify with us. If we can be persuaded that we are unified with a speaker or, well, I'm going to say a rhetor in general, a speaker, a writer, or whatever it happens to be, a rhetor, then we are much more likely to believe what they say. So identification is prior to persuasion. And the other concept of Burke's that will play a role here as well is that rhetoric, even contentious debating rhetoric, is a purification of war. It moves war from the level of engagement to hurt each other, to win, to the level of engagement that involves those words that always have the possibility of inducing cooperation, if we can remain engaged, recognizing our commonalities. Then I do this. And I click. So my first book, Burke War Words, traced the development of those concepts and everything that swirled around them during the Second World War. Modern rhetoric, in other words, grew out of the desire to build a public out of the ruins of war and the fear of continued war. Obviously, there are many spheres where this can happen. Legislatures can debate best policies, courts can determine proper practices. But as a professor of English, I am most interested in the cultural sphere. And the area I particularly study is heritage museums. I'm fascinated and frequently impressed with how the best museums walk the line between conserving the truth of the past in such a way that even increasingly diverse publics will accept it in the present, and narrating that truth in a way that will lead those visitors to walk out and make better choices for the future. For my most recent book, Museum Rhetoric, I spent several years visiting national museums in 22 nations on 6 continents to see how they can act as both cultural glue. Oh, wait, I have a picture of multiple museums. Cultural glue, holding the nation together in one collective narrative, and cultural goad, calling people to value a better future. So let me pause here for a quick example. This is the National Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongarewa. It does a lot of things right. Within the framework of a diverse though shared values, it raises difficult issues about the past, like enforced boarding schools, and from the present, like ignoring ongoing discrimination and the New Zealand equivalent of the civil rights movement. But what I found really key to their ability to raise these difficult issues is that it asserts first a common identity with the land of New Zealand, and then a shifting sense of national identity. In an exhibit called A Slice of Heaven, there it is, the final placard in this exhibit, and it was about New Zealand in the 20th century. The final placard summed up the Te Papa message of continuity alongside continual change. Us and them, it said, there you go. Us and them. Entering the 1950s, New Zealand society seems prosperous, peaceful, integrated. The us behind this image of unity are heterosexual Pakeha blokes, male European New Zealanders, the country's dominant players. Other groups, however, find themselves marginalized. In the 1970s and 80s, different voices start to speak out. Women, gay rights activists, anti-apartheid activists are among those protesting. By the century's end, many diverse groups have a say in New Zealand society and politics. They have become us. The Essential Guide to Te Papa, which is like the little museum guidebook, defines this new us as someone with what it calls Kiwi identity. Kiwis are like it's like Yanks. It's the, nickname for us New Zealanders. Kiwi identity, asserting Kiwis live in a broadly egalitarian society and believe that everyone deserves a fair go. Widespread protests have reflected Kiwis' willingness to oppose injustice or back a principle. The museum is telling its audience that Kiwis that modern day contemporary Kiwis have an identity that the nation can be proud of, even as it continues to debate, including inside the museum, as we'll see in a minute, just what that identity means. This is an example of the way that glue and goad can work together. The dichotomy between unity and diversity that we face today is also the dilemma that Kenneth Burke addressed when he proposed a rhetorical response to what he called the tragic frame animosities of the late 1930s. This is his rhetoric, this is his notion of the comic corrective. He wrote that, as you can see, human enlightenment can go no further than in picturing people not as vicious, but as mistaken. When you add that people are necessarily mistaken, that all people are exposed to situations in which they must act as fools, that every insight contains its own special kind of blindness, you complete the comic circle, returning again to the lesson of humility that underlies great tragedy. So what's this saying? First, if everyone's perspective is necessarily limited, then our opponents are not, in their being, evil people who are beyond the pale. They are instead tragically mistaken people who are blind to their own blindnesses, whom we might help to view events through a wider frame if we remain engaged. Of course, nobody's ever been convinced by being made to feel stupid. So the second insight of the comic corrective is also necessary, that if everyone's perspective is necessarily limited, then our own perspective, right as it seems, is also limited. We're also blind to our blindnesses. This might sound like relativism. We're all just fools. And that can lead to the kinds of messages that I actually think are not helpful right now. Messages like, we've been so divided. Let's just move on. Let bygones be bygones. After all, there are good people on both sides. I think that attitude leads us to tamp down justifiable moral outrage in favor of playing nice, erasing the crime and erasing the victim so that we get to maintain a veneer of pleasantry. That, I argue, is what we can do because we're privileged. And that is not what the comic frame is suggesting. Moral outrage, calling out for change in change of systems that oppress others, is not bad, just as impassioned debate is not war. But outrage comes in two varieties. And we're back to Burke here, right? Two varieties. One is the tragic frame of factional tragedy, where all good lies with one side, all evil with the other. The other kind takes that factional outrage and passes it through the filter of the comic frame of universal tragedy, which is universal because it acknowledges flaws in everyone, including the hero, the good character. I lost my spot. The good character moved by motives of justifiable vengeance. The real enemy then in the comic frame is not the other, but over certainty. All of our blindnesses to our own inevitable blindness. Calling opponents vicious merely perpetuates the cycle, warranted or not, structuring conflict in such polarized ways that no social change is possible without some form of violence. A comic frame doesn't lead to papering over differences with niceties, but it does lead to enough humility about our own blindnesses that it purifies war, taking us from I will kill you to I will debate you. I will remain engaged with you even in difficult conversations. In a rhetorical context, this is only here because I needed something to look at. So the planet is nice. In a rhetorical context, debate is always good because to really debate someone, you have to be engaged with them, convinced that they are in some degree persuadable, just as they must be convinced about you. Burke would also say that you have to be able to identify with each other, to see something in them, something of them in you and you in them, some commonality in the imagined community of the nation or the region, whatever it is, the imagined community. Now, I heard the Black rhetorician Theon Hall say the other day that he doesn't hold out a lot of hope for this kind of dialogue right now because America is currently not willing to acknowledge that we even need to have this moment of repentance. And if we can't really have a conversation about the past 4 years or systemic racism or economic inequality or commonalities of fear and despair, then until we're honest about this reality, we're not going to be able to move past it. So what's to be done? Going back to the spheres of rhetoric, the legislature, the courts, the general public sphere of, say, social media, I think we can all see how these are currently structured as a zero-sum game of winners and losers, a tragic frame setting. And this is, again, why I find the cultural space of heritage museums such a hopeful place. I'm a member of the executive board of the International Committee for Museology, which is a subgroup of the world's largest museum network, ICOM, the International Council on Museums, which is made up of some 45,000 museum professionals from 138 countries. And this is our meeting in Kyoto, Japan last fall. And we're continually debating, including here, this was a really, really contentious meeting, really continually debating what the role of museums in the world is, how to work across divisions to care for the tangible and intangible heritage of each place, and to promote the kinds of visions that engage visitors to make their community a better place. The debates are not pleasant or amicable all the time, but they are not war. They are the heated purification of war. And among members, the general consensus is that, as I heard a Portuguese scholar reiterate the other day, museums should be places that will make you uncomfortable enough to think. Indeed, a common museum dictum is to be a safe place for unsafe ideas, to allow visitors the comfort to feel somewhat uncomfortable, to have their biases challenged, while encouraging them to identify in a new way with a larger, more inclusive sense of their own collective identity. To not just reflect the local or national heritage, but to question it. To get us to question it. Who we are may not be who you thought we were or who you wish we were, but a well-done museum exhibit or educational program can give you the opportunity to rethink your ideas, re-identify with a revised collective identity, and therefore be more ready to enter the dialogue about this, what this we can do in a new way. So let me give you another quick example of an exhibit. This one, whoa, there we go. This one from the Swedish National Museum, the Nordiska, which is there in the background with this person photobombing the foreground. The Nordiska Museet in Stockholm. Scandinavia has, the whole region, has an indigenous population that you might, we used to call Laplanders, but we do not anymore. They are the Sami peoples, and their land is called Sapmi. It stretches, across Norway, Sweden, Finland, into Russia. A century ago, the Nordiska was a typical colonialist collecting museum, sending its curators out to Sapmi. Actually, they were from Sweden, so they mostly sent them to Norway to get Norway's stuff. And they sent them out to Sapmi to collect cool stuff, kind of like Indiana Jones. Ooh, this belongs in a museum. So what to do today with all that stuff that they have? The Nordiska exhibit Sapmi works in conjunction with a team of, and I wish I had a better picture. All my slides are at my work, in my office. They have all kinds of quite lovely stuff, right? But the exhibit itself worked in conjunction with a team of Sami community collaborators to show how Sami cultural interests, not just like, oh, look at that cool stuff, but Sami cultural interests intersect both in unity and division with Swedish culture. To question whether the Nordiska had the right to the artifacts it was displaying right there in the exhibit, and also to get visitors, who are, again, mostly urban Swedes at this point, to ask some big questions about their own understanding of their heritage. Questions like, whose heritage is it? Who gets to tell the story? Who got here first, and how much does that matter? These are not the sort of questions that we ponder on Twitter. But a museum is a setting where we expect to think, to theorize, because we don't expect to immediately be called upon to act, to vote, to find someone guilty or innocent, the other kinds of rhetorical spaces, right? We're given space in a museum to think, to hear a variety of voices, including the ones that we disagree with. So back to the Te Papa Museum, in the Te Papa Museum in New Zealand, in the center of the museum is this, right there, the Treaty of Waitangi, a central document used by Indigenous Maori to reclaim rights in a new New Zealand. And then surrounding the Treaty of Waitangi are these columns here that are sound columns, and that project voices. Actually, I have another picture too of it. But yeah, that's a better picture of a sound column there. That project voices. Of course, looking away now, I lost my place. There we go. They project voices that think that talk about how the Treaty of Waitangi is the founding document of the new nation, and also voices that think this whole rights business has just gone too far, and voices that are everywhere in between. The museum itself is clearly on the side of it's the foundational document group, because the treaty, after all, hangs in this very central spot. But it is operating in the comic frame, not demonizing the opposition, but inviting them into the debate. And it also supports this with a series of long-running treaty talks, talks that it does in the evening, kind of like this. Closer to home, the Freedom Center and Underground Railroad Museum in Cincinnati this is the inside of the museum and its director, tells the story of slavery and abolition from the banks of the good side of the Ohio River. We can be proud of the abolitionists in Ohio's past. But the museum also points out not only past injustices and threats, but also present day ones. And then at the end of it, it has a very large, it has a final exhibit, actually quite a large final exhibit, discussing human trafficking and providing a call to action and specific tasks that we can do to walk out of the museum and take steps to stop this modern day version of slavery. It also had a small exhibit a few years back on Native American mascots for sports teams. It made connections in this museum that, again, is focused on the Underground Railroad, right? Made connections to minstrel shows and to blackface, as well as to other Native kinds of stereotyping. It held up Miami University, like Miami of Ohio University, for praise for its principled change of team name and working together with local tribe members. And then at the very, very end of the exhibit, and again, we're in Ohio, it showed that placard, which for some reason will only come out in black and white in this slideshow. I don't know why. But it did not start with the message, are you an Indians fan? For shame, right? It let you work through the exhibit, think about what you're seeing, think about how it connects to other kinds of stereotypical harmful language, right? Harmful symbols, and then get a nudge to reconsider your perspective from the perspective of someone else, to become aware of your own blindness, so to speak. These same things occur in various ways in the Smithsonian museums, and I could talk more about them, but I won't for time. But I will say that I am very encouraged that Lonnie Bunch, who's down there in the corner, that's Lonnie, the founding director of the National African American Museum of History and Culture, is now the secretary of the overall Smithsonian Institution. Because Lonnie is a very strong voice for thoughtful, engaged discomfort. In fact, I really recommend the African American Museum's Talking About Race initiative, which you can find on their website, and I can type it into the chat as well. It's called Talking About Race, and it's on their homepage. It's a great resource. Bunch is also a master of finding commonalities in order to give us the needed space to first identify with the nation and then expand our thinking. And he did a really good job of that in this month's Smithsonian Magazine, where he's celebrating Veterans Day on the National Mall. Which he first places into a very American context of going to watch the parades with his veteran dad as a kid. And then he expands the sense of who is a veteran and who deserves to be memorialized in the American story. So he writes about, I'm not going to read the part where he writes about going to the parades, but he goes to the parades, and then he goes on to say, Veterans Day has always brought the unimaginable scope of war to a human scale. It invites us to remember our history, to honor both those who served recently and those who served long ago, and it asks us to consider what service means in our own lives. As a museum complex, the Smithsonian has a unique responsibility to honor our veterans. Through exhibitions like We Return Fighting at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, we're telling lesser known stories of those who fought for democracy abroad. And this November, the Smithsonian celebrates Veterans Day by marking the completion of the National Native American Veterans Memorial at the National Museum of the American Indian. Native peoples have served in the United States military since the American Revolution and continue to serve at one of the highest rates per capita of any population group. As commissioned by Congress, the memorial will recognize for the first time on a national scale the extraordinary service of these men and women and our shared obligation to honor this legacy. So we all can identify every reader of Smithsonian Magazine can identify with parades, honor, service. And now he says, let's all together honor all of our veterans. And this sort of like, here we're in common, now let's expand. So what does reconciliation toward a renewed sense of national identity look like in light of systemic injustices? In my next book, which doesn't have a name because I'm going to start working on it this summer, but my plan is to really explore further the paradox of the truth and reconciliation model that emerged in the global South at the end of the 20th century in places that went through serious conflict like Argentina, Chile, South Africa, and Rwanda. How should reconciliation be framed today in the face of ongoing divisions? What lessons does it hold for our divided nation as we seek to both awaken to injustices and lessen antipathies? In the Genocide Museum in Kigali, Rwanda, they explain their approach to truth and reconciliation in this way. They say, education has become our way forward. We need to learn about the past. We also need to learn from it. Rwanda is determined to work toward reconciliation. First, we have to reckon with the past to make reconciliation a possibility. Victims need to feel secure. Perpetrators have to face justice, engaging in open and honest discussion about the past, agreeing about it, admitting it. These are the fundamentals to achieve a secure enough trust to live together. Trust will not be rushed. Foundations are laid now. Notice the keys here. Knowing the past, honestly confronting it, engaging in dialogue, all are necessary for reconciliation to occur. The dismembering of the nation state is rarely peaceful. We need unity. But building unity around a more just and inclusive understanding of what that unity means is also critical for real reconciliation to occur. So let me end with one quick example from the Jewish Museum in Berlin. People are probably familiar with this important space confronting the Holocaust and then educating about 1,000 years of Jewish life in Germany. Germany really is a model for confronting the past in its public museums and memorials across the country. But at the end of this museum's tour, at the end of the tour at the Jewish Museum in Berlin, just in case visitors are now kind of congratulating themselves on how woke they are to Judaism and its German legacy, there's a room with little benches and voice cubes where you can kind of sit with individuals who are testifying to the continuing anti-Semitism and reluctance to face the past that continues today in Germany. This, okay, let's just move on phenomenon is really global. And the museum points out what that looks like and who is hurt by it, so that the desire for reconciliation doesn't erase the voice of the victimized. So to sum up, what conclusions can we draw from the rhetoric of heritage museums? I would say rhetoric and heritage museum, let's do both, right? Debate is not bad. Debate is the purification of war. So having vociferous conversations is not a bad thing. We need to hear a multiplicity of voices. This is one of the things that museums are struggling a lot with, and also in many instances doing really well, the polyphony of voices that don't have to be in agreement with each other. We don't have to have one version of the past. Moral outrage is not bad because it keeps us from erasing the victims. The victims need to be heard. But the comic corrective asks us to look at our situation, remembering that we're all blind to our own blindnesses, including the blindness that makes us sure that we are good and right heroes fighting those evil others. We need to remember and be reminded of our commonalities first in order to to identify with others in order to engage in persuasive dialogue. Actually, I can point out that the Te Papa does this really well, where it gets at the idea of difficult conversations after a huge focus. The museum actually opens with kind of like the natural history section, and it talks about the unique land of New Zealand and all of that. And then it goes into this, there's a whole part that talks about how there's voices of ranchers and Maori elders and backpackers and urban dwellers who go out and go camping on the weekends, and all these people talking about how much they love the land and how important the land is to them. And there's this great sense of commonality that New Zealanders all together live in this very unique place and share this common bond. And now let's talk about the things that divide us. So identifying first, and then and saying, yes, we are one, and then being able to engage in persuasive dialogue. We need a safe space in both space and time to think unsafe ideas. And then we need a push to actually think those ideas. Museums are a good spot for that because they're just, because of the kind of rhetoric that they promote, which is not rhetoric that calls on us to make an immediate action. We don't have to we're not listening to a debate in a legislature having to vote on it. We're not in a courtroom. We are in rhetorical terms in an epideictic space and can think about things like values and can just have time to actually think. But then we also need the push of don't get too comfortable, think about things. We need to have open, honest conversations about the past, to hear the voices of victims and encourage perpetrators to participate in those conversations. And finally, we need to listen, to be sincerely sorry for what we were, and actually I want to emphasize that, and proud of what we together can become. And then we need to walk out the door and make it happen. So to finish, as a rhetorician, I'm deeply interested in the viability of the public sphere. It's kind of what rhetoric does. As a museologist who has studied the cultural impacts of national identity, I believe that this imagined community of the public sphere has a real impact on our sense of self, and therefore on the actions that individually and collectively we believe that this self can accomplish as we seek to envision a more just and also a more peaceful world. So that's it for me. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And thank you very much. Questions, comments, and stuff.
Thank you very much, Liz. You can either show a clap of hands or you can choose a reaction or both. I'm going to do a thumbs up and a clap. And I'll also do this as well. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. Please send me your questions via chat and I will pass those along. Maybe I can start off a little bit here with you, Liz. Have you had a chance to visit the Peace Memorial Museum in Hiroshima, Japan? Was that part of your...
No, I only saw Kyoto when I was in Japan. It was an entire week in Kyoto. But I was actually, the Peace Memorial Museum was on my list that I made just the other week of places I want to visit for this next book.
Yeah, I think that would be a wonderful place given what you outlined. It was very impactful for me. Of course, I knew the kind of U.S. side of it with Los Alamos and the Manhattan Project, and of course all the physics associated with thermonuclear weapons. But going there and seeing how they treated, and it's wonderful what they did, and it really put the humanity aspect to it. I mean, it's hard to leave there with a dry eye when you see a lot of the exhibits. And
I think that is an example of one of the big controversies that everybody remembers from museum studies is the controversy over the Enola Gay exhibit at the Smithsonian back in, 20 years ago or so now. And the idea that you would have an exhibit in the American History Museum that's actually saying, wow, something bad happened. And that was, or maybe it was the air and space, who knows. And the idea that you can have both things, that like, let's talk about, I don't know what the Enola Gay exhibit actually did end up talking about, probably some of the, the amazing thought and technology that went into developing the atomic bomb, and it ended a horrific war. And it also, in fact, killed an awful lot of people and condemned an awful lot of people to, radiation sickness and death over a generation. There's a lot of things that went on that are all part of the same story. And to say that that's all part of the same story, it's harder, I think, this is why I'm actually I kind of follow what Lonnie Bunch is doing at the Smithsonian. He's only been there just like he's been at the secretary for like the last year maybe. But I'm really interested to see what he's going to do, because I think it's very hard for America to do that sort of thing as much as perhaps not all other countries. Obviously, a lot of other countries also have a really hard time doing this, but we don't do it particularly well.
We have some questions rolling in from Gwyneth. We have, given the current state of different political parties rejecting any common news sites, how can people even begin to hold conversations?
I think that we need, actually one of the first steps is to say that, again, thinking of lessons from museums, right? Because then I've thought about this all the time in the last week. This has basically been all I've thought about is, what lessons are there? How can we possibly start to talk, across divisions? And also I've been thinking to myself, do I even want to do that? Do I want to talk to those people, right? How do I do that? And I think that one of the things that, in putting together this talk, one of the lessons that I kind of realized is that the way that that museums encourage that is to not start with like, okay, look at us, look at our division here. So you and I disagree about something, about the political situation, and I say, hey, Mike, let's go to lunch and talk about our differences. But instead, I would say, hey, Mike, let's get together. How's it going? Let's find our commonalities first. Let's get into a comfortable space, essentially, where we don't have to, whatever our differences are, we're not going to somehow have to immediately act on them, and then actually bring up what, like, to not say, not just stop at that nice happy spot where we're like, so how's the kid, Mike? Oh yeah, my daughter's doing this. Okay, this and that. And now we're all fine. I'm heading off to my house thinking, and I'm still thinking, yeah, that stupid guy, what did he end up? We actually have that conversation where I say, there are actual real differences, and they involve real people. So maybe we can talk about not like political ideologies, but again, any narrative. This is a big thing. Museums are all about narrative, but really any kind of narrative that says, let's take it out of this abstract thought and say, who are the people involved? And also that there's a reason why you think the things that you do, that you're thinking of people as well. And so I'm not just saying, let me tell you about the victims that you've hurt, but also, listening to you talk about why you think the things you do. Who are you thinking of when you're thinking that you are right? Which is a much harder thing to do, because I'm like still thinking you're wrong, but we at least start with a commonality. We agree that we're engaged in some way, and we have a conversation, and we don't let those voices of other people, of essentially the victims, we do not let them just kind of fall by the wayside, so we can have this nice little, happy talk thing.
That sounds like good advice. Along that same vein, we have a question here. We are at a point in international politics following a contentious election. There was an election, and 4 years of our leaders curating differences and encouraging division, how would you advise our new leader to find commonalities and move forward? How can we make that happen, or how can we help make that happen?
I mean, again, I think that we have to, I think the nation has to be reminded that we're actually all Americans together, for one thing, like whatever that means to us. And how do you get people to think? I was thinking about this because I was thinking another part of rhetoric says you don't bother to argue. I mean, this is both the good and the bad. You don't bother to argue with people that you absolutely know will not be swayed by your argument, which is in part a way of saying, you know, don't argue with your crazy Uncle Joe at Thanksgiving. But do perhaps, okay, so crazy Uncle Joe is sitting at the table with you. You're not going to just engage in this continual debate trying to convince him of something, but there's a whole bunch of other people sitting around the table too. So you don't just let Uncle Joe go off about, you know, whatever he's spewing and not respond, because you're not trying to convince him, you're trying to convince the other people around the table. And so I think in part, if we say, who are the people who are absolutely most just hardcore convinced that, you know, we are utterly split apart and that this side is utterly wrong. Well, you're not going to convince those people, but you can engage with the thought that what you're doing actually is convincing the people that are kind of like, whoa, I don't know about that election, and I just kind of liked the way he talked, and it sort of seemed like he talked like me, and you know, whatever. And I'm kind of really concerned about the economy and stuff like that. And I, as a student in my class said the other day, trying actually really hard to engage with another student, something, and she had said something, and he had said, his response was something like, well, now I'm not going to defend the president. I know he's a racist and something. Perhaps he was a homophobe. But he's really trying hard to, you know, do whatever it was, economic policy or independence from China or whatever thing. Then it's like, did you just really say, oh gosh, I know he's a racist and a homophobe, but there's this other thing. But it's, instead of saying, shame you, how, you know, how can you possibly, you know, you're going to excuse that? Instead, to say that person is actually persuadable. I believe that person is persuadable, but I also believe that in order to persuade him, because he's like trying to say, he's signaling that he's persuadable, but it also means I need to listen to him and say, well, where are you from? Why is that so important to you? And what do you mean? And do you just, you know, what is it that got you to the point where you could say, hey, that's okay, because there's this other thing is so important. And what doesn't work is, here, let me give you all the facts about how mistaken you are, which I think we do a lot. Let me tell you, oh, you think the whole problem is China? Let me overwhelm you with facts about the truth about U.S.-China relations, or you know, something like that. But instead, let me talk about, let me actually bring in other voices. If you're willing to listen to their voices, I can bring in other voices and let you hear them in a way that is not like, okay, that's it, you got to make a decision right now, but think about this. And also let me hear you, which I'm not really going to still agree with you about, like, which of the values are most important, but I am going to understand where you're coming from a little bit better. And that might help me then to think, what more can I say to help you see why I'm going to skew the values another way.
Another question from Nestor, complimenting first you on the great talk, and he says he sees connections to social psychology and wonders if there are any discussions between museum experts and social psychology experts.
I bet so, but I'm already doing this thing where it's like I'm in rhetoric and I'm trying to learn what you museum people are trying to say. But actually, one of the things that I wrote about in my book was the connection, and I don't know what part of psychology this is because I'm not a psychologist, but I have a friend who's a marriage and family therapist, and and this idea of how we have victims and perpetrators and bystanders, and how we need to, I mean, if you think about it, how do you work past divisions in your family? And, you know, when do you say, when is saying, you know what, I was wrong and I'm sorry, not some kind of like total face losing, you know, end of the world thing, but is actually a way to move forward. The other person says, yes, you were wrong, and now now I forgive you and we're moving forward. We need to do something better about this kind of communication because this isn't working. And all the sort of the kind of connection building that you do in a relationship seems to me that we can take a lot of those lessons also and sort of expand them into a national scheme, because we're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to say, all right, bad things have happened, but how do we come back together? Which is really, you know, isn't that what like marriage and family therapy is all about? There's like this, what does reconciliation mean? It doesn't mean you're completely wrong and I'm completely right. I might feel like I'm more right than you are, but we're going to be talking about how this is not you and me, but then the dynamic that's between us, that's here someplace between where we are, which is, is the same sort of thing as, for instance, systemic racism. It's the difference between saying, you know, you yourself, I'm accusing you of being a racist, and I'm saying there is a system that we are both, I forgot the word, but we're involved. I can't think of the word I'm looking for. Enmeshed in, that makes us have more, makes like me as a white person have more privilege in this society. And this system is, this is a system that we need to understand, that it's like all of us together, and not just, you know, I recognize it and you don't, so you are clearly the bad one.
So Joan asks about if you see a place for silenced voices being expressed in museum, in particular the indigenous story, and this has obvious implications for places like the Newark Earthworks, hopefully, you know, when they get their World Heritage Site. What is your involvement there, and are there examples where, I'm combining a few questions here, are there examples where those voices really were misrepresented that you know of? And what are the impacts of that?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to say that I wrote an interesting, well, okay, for me, it was it was an interesting experience writing an article with John Lau, the director of the Newark Earthworks Center. We wrote an article together with Ken Matson, who is our geographer on the Newark campus, and the three of us, and talking about, wow, I can't remember even what we were really talking about, but what I talked about in our article, talking about the Newark Earthworks, was like one space, many different perspectives, something like that. I can't remember the name of it. To me, I was talking about the way that places like the Works and the general conversation about the earthworks had in the last 10, 15 years gone from either the sense of like Newark, it's a great place, and then we've got this kind of mound of dirt there, we don't really know what's going on with it, it's just dirt, or like, wow, this really important site, and then there's Newark. Like it used to, and it used to have like industrial greatness. I know it's not then. It's just that place, right? And there are actual videos that I think still might play at the Earthworks Museum down in Heath, talking about how like Newark today, bleh, whatever, but 2,000 years ago, it was a really different place. Like, ooh, wow, right? And that instead kind of putting those together and saying, claiming that part of Newark heritage as something that Newark can be proud of, and that it can tie into. I mean, the Works has done this with the placards and that you see as you're walking into the Sidome, where it's like space exploration. Newark has been interested in space for a long time, right? And then there's or Ohio, however they put it, and there's all this, and it starts with the Earthworks there, and it talks about that. And I'm talking about that in my paper, like, okay, so this is actually a really good thing for the town. And then John writes his part, and he's saying in part, essentially, is this appropriation of the indigenous story? Is this just another example of appropriation of the indigenous story to support Eurocentric views of things? And so how do we deal with that? Well, one way would be to make sure that Native voices are first and foremost, like right out there in putting together any sort of interpretive center of the Newark Earthworks. So it's not like, here's the Newark Earthworks, and a lot of times what you see when you're looking at archaeological sites is you get the what I call the hero story of the archaeologist. We did this dig and we found these things, and here we're going to do a whole exhibit about how, look at us doing a dig, and all this. And as a person who studied anthropology myself, I kind of feel like I can relate to that, but that's not the story that should be told. That story should be in there. Yeah. What did anthropologists end up with? But the Native story needs to be first and foremost. And I think, there's not a lot. There are a few places that do that nicely. And actually that is in fact the whole next conference of the International Committee of Museology is all about decolonizing museums and raising Indigenous voices in Toronto. It was going to be this fall, and now it's this spring, and maybe it's this summer, and maybe it's all over Zoom. Who knows? But it is part of the big conversation these days, like how to bring those voices in, and of course part of that is just leadership, right? Having actual people. And it's the same with anything, how do you get women involved or anybody else? You want women's voices, get them to be part of the leadership team. So same kind of thing.
Great. Well, that takes us to 8 o'clock. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank our speaker once again for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you all for coming too. This is neat.
Great. So please, again, remember those dates. Our next one will be January 12th next year, 2021, beginning at 7
And who's
p.m.
the speaker, Mike?
We're still working on our spring follow-up. Okay. Yeah, so it's mysterious to be announced. But we have some interesting talks coming up that we're trying to line up for that. So please stay tuned at the Granville Library to get all the information in that regard. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Hi, Jessica. Hi, Emily. Oh my gosh, it's so nice to see you.
Hi, Dr. Weiser. Thanks for doing this. It was so fun.
Where are you now? Sorry, I'm taking up your Zoom space to talk to him.
Yeah, I'm the supervisor at the Buckeye Lake Library with the Licking County.
Oh, wow. Excellent.
So I'm cheating on Licking County a little bit, but I saw that Ohio State Newark tweeted, actually Jessica saw it and she sent it to me.
Did they? Okay.
So we thought it would be a nice
cool
evening to go back. So, thank you, Lucy.
Oh, of course. I'm glad you could join us. I saw you signed up for something else too.
I
so
did for the pom pom regiment.
Cool.
We're happy to have you.
You see, I've been doing a little or teeny tiny origami stars to keep my hands busy. So I like
Oh my gosh.
things.
I'm impressed.
We
Thank
always do a
you.
craft, so keep an eye open for us.
Yeah, I started watching.
Oh, did you?
All right. Have a good evening, everybody.
You too.